What's the millennial question?
Apparently, millennials as a generation, which is a group of people who were born approximately 1984 and after, are tough to manage.
About how millennials present themselves physically in an interview. They come overly casually dressed, maybe a young man doesn't wear a tie.
Have lower rates of employment overall, they have lower earnings, lower savings, and then layered on top of that, they have debt.
We've all heard it. The idea that millennials are worse off than any generation before them. 59% can't afford a $1,000 emergency expense. Most millennials can't afford a home, and many are still living with their parents. Nearly 75% of millennials are living paycheck to paycheck, yet 70% of them plan to leave their jobs, and on and on and on. This widespread belief paints all millennials as being broke, lazy, and downright financially illiterate. And that all of this is thanks to the boomers in government and the 2008 financial crisis that permanently destroyed the economy for younger generations. This is the mainstream narrative, but it's also complete and utter baloney. Every single statistic that you see on those headlines are cherry-picked to push a narrative. Consider, for example, the statistic that when boomers were in their early 30s, they controlled 20% of the national wealth. But when millennials were in their early 30s, they only controlled 3.5% of the national wealth. This seems like a massive discrepancy, and it is. But what most of these studies fail to mention is the other discrepancies that easily explain this, like demographics. When boomers were growing up, the US population was over 100 million less. As such, boomers made up for a lot more of the population than millennials did. In fact, when you account for this one discrepancy, the wealth discrepancy not only goes away, but it actually inverts. I kid you not. Millennials on a per capita basis are actually slightly wealthier than boomers were at the same age. But how could that be? Aren't all millennials broke bums living with their parents? Well, the truth is that there's a whole nother group of millennials that are never mentioned, that are richer than any generation before them. And I'm not talking about some sort of elite top 0.1%. I'm talking about the 35% who have net worths over 100,000, the 18% who have net worths over $250,000, the 9% who have net worths over $500,000, and the 3% who are already millionaires. Also, keep in mind, millennials are predominantly in their 30s right now. So it's safe to say that a large portion of this 35% will end up as millionaires, multimillionaires, and decamillionaires. Now, of course, being a millionaire is already not the same, and it won't be the same in 30 years. But it's also a far cry from the narrative that portrays millennials solely as financially struggling losers that are still reliant on their parents. The reality is that a large portion of millennials are actually way richer than you think. So join me as we take a look at how this narrative came to be and discover the truth about millennial wealth. Alright, so if millennials are actually doing just as well as previous generations on a per capita basis, why do they get such a bad rep? Is it just a vocal minority or a media bias, or is there more to it? Well, I think we can get a better idea when we take a look at the wealthiest people from each generation. The average net worth of millennials who consider themselves wealthy is $531,000. On average, millennials needed $100,000 more than Gen Xers to feel wealthy. The only generation that needed more money than millennials to feel wealthy was boomers, who on average needed $692,000. But wait a minute, that means that millennials have lower expectations than boomers, but aren't even able to achieve these lower expectations because of the crony economy, right? Well, actually no, because you have to consider that they're in completely different stages of life. Boomers are predominantly in their 60s, meaning that their context is retirement. This means that boomers on average think that $692,000 is enough for retirement as a whole. Meanwhile, millennials are wanting $531,000 as 30-year-olds with 30 more years in the workforce. And taking a look at their retirement expectations, this all makes sense. On average, millennials are wanting $1.8 million for retirement, or nearly triple what boomers are looking for. Even high inflation and rising living costs don't account for that massive disparity in expectations. But you know what does? Perception. Wealth is a rather subjective topic. 2.5 million might be middle class in San Francisco, but in Nebraska, that would be quite wealthy. A significant portion of the perception that millennials are financially challenged stems from this subjectivity. In general, millennials who are objectively well off may not consider themselves as such, reinforcing the notion of millennials' financial struggles. This notion is less about their actual financial well-being and more about their ambitious aspirations. Again, let me reiterate, millennials don't think that $500,000 is even enough to be considered wealthy, while boomers think that $700,000 is wealthy enough to straight up retire. But how does such a massive discrepancy in wealth expectations manifest between generations? Well, the answer is easy: social media. Various studies have found that millennials approach wealth from a comparative basis, while boomers tend to approach wealth from an objective basis. For example, a boomer might evaluate their financial status based on expenses, groceries, taxes, insurance premiums, and so on. If they can comfortably afford these expenses for a prolonged period without active income, they tend to classify themselves as wealthy. Millennials, on the other hand, don't define wealth based on sustainability. In fact, sustainability has nothing to do with their equation. Rather, they define wealth based on what their richest friends can do. Being able to go on the same vacations, live in the same luxury buildings, eat out at the same restaurants, and so on. In fact, 47% of millennials compare their lives to their peers on social media, while only 13% of boomers compare their lives to their social circles. This explains why millennials have such a bad financial rep despite doing just as well as previous generations. The reality is that 50% of millennials are actually just broke, but the other 50% are actually pretty well off, but they would never describe themselves as such because their expectations are multiple times higher than any previous generation. Thus, the entire generation is frequently misrepresented as being financially disadvantaged, which isn't true. But something that is true about millennials is the raging wealth divide. The media often frames the wealth divide as a conflict between the top 1% and the rest of society. However, the reality is more nuanced. It's actually a struggle between the upper 50% and the lower 50%, and I think this graph really showcases this phenomenon. The top 50% of millennials have net worths anywhere between $46,000 and $3 million, which again is pretty good. If we look at the left side of this graph though, it gets ugly real quickly. A net worth of 0 somehow puts you in the 20th percentile, meaning that nearly 1 in 5 millennials have a negative net worth. So the middle class is indeed disappearing, but not in the way that is often portrayed. Not everyone is becoming broke. The top half, and especially the top quarter, are thriving in the new economy. The bottom half, and especially the bottom quarter, are getting annihilated. But how did we get here? People often like to point the finger at politics and capitalism, but I think the answer has more to do with 3 social trends, starting with the 2008 financial crisis. Discussions surrounding the recession typically center around its impact on the job market, economy, and opportunities. But the most important item that the recession destroyed, at least for millennials, was their investing spirit. It's kind of a meme that millennials are the degenerates gambling on options and AMC and NFTs and all of that crap, but that's actually such a small portion of millennials. The vast majority of millennials are actually extremely conservative when it comes to investments. In fact, they prefer to just hoard cash. 65% of millennial wealth is held in cash, the highest of any generation, and much of the rest is in real estate. Only a mere 15% is actually invested in stocks, which is really bad when you consider that boomers have 24% invested in stocks, even though they're supposed to be the risk-averse ones. The 2008 financial crisis gave millennials investing PTSD like no other generation. In fact, 57% of millennials admit that the crisis still influences their investing choices today, while the same is only true for 39% of Gen Xers and just 13% of boomers. Given that investing is the key to not just retirement, but financial freedom in general, especially in terms of high inflation, it's no wonder why there's such a wealth divide amongst millennials. There's the half that invests and the half that doesn't. Many millennials would argue that they just don't have enough money to invest, and this is also often true because many of them are stuck in mountains of college debt. Of course, the skyrocketing price of tuition very much plays a role here, but I believe the crisis is more closely linked to the relevance of education. millennials were strongly urged to pursue higher education, which was often touted as the key to securing good jobs and success. As such, 38% of millennials ended up getting a degree, while only 32% of Gen Xers and 15% of boomers have a degree. However, this has largely backfired, as a lot of millennials ended up getting degrees just because they were told to do so, resulting in a bunch of expensive degrees that have no value in the job market. As such, many of these millennials would end up getting jobs that didn't even need a degree or paid more for a degree, making it even harder to pay off their debt. If they didn't end up in one of these jobs, it's more than likely that they ended up in one of the new age gig economy jobs, which is even worse. We're talking food delivery, ride sharing, freelancers, etc. On paper, these jobs actually have pretty good salaries, but what they don't have is any benefits, which makes them far worse. A police officer or teacher may only make $60K, but they get another $60K worth of benefits in the form of health insurance, retirement benefits, paid time off, set working hours, a better tax situation, etc. An Uber driver making $60K, on the other hand, is closer to earning minimum wage. So I think much of the millennial wealth divide can be explained by an aversion to investing, irrelevant degrees associated with massive college debt, and the modern gig economy. But with that being said, I think one factor trumps all of these. Almost the entirety of the millennial wealth divide can be explained by one factor and one factor alone: technology. Millennials who have embraced tech are experiencing remarkable success, while those who have not find themselves struggling. And I'm not just talking about coders and project managers, I'm talking about people who leverage tech versus people who didn't. You can see this in any profession. The wealthiest lawyers are the ones serving tech companies, not the local judges. The wealthiest teachers are the ones selling online courses, not the ones in public schools or even Harvard professors. The wealthiest accountants are the ones helping tech companies save on their taxes, not the ones working at the IRS. And the wealthiest doctors are the ones on social media, not even the ones doing neurosurgery. While this inclination was already taking shape during the Boomer and Gen X generations, it has escalated to an unprecedented degree amongst millennials. Before 2000, non-tech people in inflation-adjusted terms were making 40 to 60K, while tech people were making 70 to 90K. Some might cross 100,000, but that was pretty much it. Today, it's still hard for non-tech people to reach 70 or 90K, but tech people are able to reach 200, 500, $1 million per year by the time they're 30 or 40. The disparity between non-tech and tech people is no longer 40 or 50%, it's straight up a magnitude. And it's no wonder why. The leverage, scale, and efficiency that's possible with tech is incomparable to any traditional job. As such, their earnings potential is far higher. Also, remember all of those shortfalls that we were previously discussing? Well, those are automatically solved by tech. Take stock investing, for example. If you're in tech, you're either going to be forced to take stock compensation whether you like it or not, or you're earning so much that even if you're conservative with your stock investing, it adds up to a substantial amount. Also, if your degree aligns with the tech sector, the ROI of college becomes astronomical and paying back the debt becomes no problem at all. It's the same thing with the gig economy. While certain gigs like being an Uber driver might be less appealing, other tech-driven opportunities such as becoming a YouTuber, entering e-commerce, owning Airbnb rentals, or being a remote tech worker is extraordinarily favorable. The bottom line is that the modern economy works for tech people and people who are 1 to 2 degrees of separation away from tech. For everyone else, it sucks. And this is precisely what's manifesting in millennial wealth. 50% are doing way better than you think, but the other 50% are doing way worse than you think, and that is the true state of millennials. AI is no doubt the next frontier, but I don't think it'll replace as many jobs as people think. Check out this video to learn more, but until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.